Usually, when you hear a ghost story, it doesn't end with somebody being murdered. Normally, somebody sees or hears something that they can't explain and then they move out. But there was a haunting in Tennessee that was so bizarre, it actually became a local folk legend. Hundreds of people had witnessed a spirit's uncanny ability to accurately pinpoint information about them and their personal lives. But things took a turn for the worst when the spirit supposedly became vengeful and killed one of the town's local residents. On this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the Bell Witch and some of the stories surrounding her. I'm your host, Alex Morell, and this is Odd Encounters. In the year 1817, near what's now Adams, Tennessee, John Bell was taking a stroll through a cornfield when he spotted a strange-looking dog. Apparently, the dog has a regular body with an incredibly small head that has rabbit-like ears sticking off of it. So, John pulls up his rifle and he goes full John Wick on this thing and fires several shots. But, thankfully for everyone around him, he wasn't a very good shot, and when the smoke clears, the dog is nowhere to be found. Later that night, he assumes that he might be dealing with the dog again when he and his wife Lucy are woken up from a dead sleep to the sound of scratching and gnawing outside of the cabin. John grabs his coat and his rifle and he goes to the outside to check, but he doesn't find anything. When he returns to the cabin, all 9 of his children are in their living room and they're also complaining that they've been woken up to the sounds of scratching as well. This goes on for the next few nights until the sound eventually comes from the inside of the cabin. But the sound has also changed at this point because it's now sounding like a low growling noise with chains rattling and occasionally the sound of rats gnawing on the bedposts. But when John and Lucy try to investigate, they don't find any kind of evidence. And it definitely seems to target their 12-year-old daughter Betsy because she's now covered with bruises, scratches, and she keeps waking up saying that somebody's poking her with pins. For whatever reason, John decides to make another heroic decision of keeping this a secret because he doesn't want any of the neighbors to know what they're dealing with. This goes on for over a year before John finally cracks and tells his neighbor James. Him and James are fairly close, so he figures James can probably be trusted with a secret. So he tries to convince James to stay the night at the Bell residence and basically prove to him and his family that everything they were dealing with was basically all in their heads. And James doesn't really give it a second thought. He's just kind of like, yeah, bro, I can do that. I got you. But that night, when James is getting settled in for bed, his covers are yanked off of him. But instead of panicking, he basically decides, I wonder what happens if I try to talk to this thing. And to his surprise, every time that he speaks or asks a question, the spirit stops what it's doing and then responds to his questions by knocking on the wall. But after seeing this for himself, John's mind has changed because he finally decides, maybe we should let more people into the house and we might get some kind of an answer. So as more and more people are flooding into the house and communicating with this spirit, they're quickly learning that it's actually able to answer their questions like, how far to the nearest river, or how many people have you visited today? But eventually the noises stop and they become this low, raspy voice, almost like the sound of wind moving through a room. And then they eventually get stronger and become the sound of a young woman's voice. And at this point, the Bell family finally gets their first answer, because John decides to ask, "Who are you?" When the disembodied voice responds, it states that, "I was a spirit. I was once happy, but I have been disturbed." Now, at this point, the Bell family has been living with this spirit for over a year, so it's kind of like a if you can't beat 'em, join 'em kind of a situation. And with all of the visits of people communicating and asking questions, they slowly start to realize that this spirit is very intelligent. It's apparently able to quote the entirety of the Christian Bible, and it knows pretty much any and all church hymnals that all of the townsfolk would sing. The spirit seems to really enjoy religious debate, and it also seems to really enjoy the company of James. It even gives him the nickname Sugarmouth for his ability to smoothly recite Bible scripture. But over time, the Bell family comes to learn that the spirit doesn't just know everything about the Bible. It seems to know about everything that happens in Red River. One night, two of the local pastors pay the Bell residents a visit to meet with the spirit again, when it reveals to them that it had witnessed both of their sermons earlier that day. The problem? Both of the pastors had given sermons at 11 a.m. at two separate churches. But somehow, the spirit was able to repeat both of their sermons verbatim. The spirit even goes on to reveal intricate details about the other town's residents and some of their private conversations. Now we come to learn too that the spirit seems to be a bit of a prankster, because on one occasion, it tells John that it's the spirit of an indigenous person whose remains were disturbed. But John and Lucy start freaking out internally because several years before this, one of John's sons and his friend were out exploring when they apparently came across some indigenous remains, and they basically desecrated the burial site because they wanted some kind of treasure. And one of the boys ends up bringing home a jawbone to the Bell residence, and they destroy the jawbone, but one of the teeth falls through the floorboard. The spirit claims that she's looking for that tooth specifically, so in an attempt to appease the spirit, John rips up the floorboards and spends the next few days digging around, but when he doesn't find anything, he has to come back and tell the spirit, "Hey, I got nothing." But to his amazement, the spirit bursts out into laughter and then states that it has nothing to do with the tooth at all. So now John is extremely fed up, and he demands that the spirit tell him, "Who are you?" But to everyone's amazement, the spirit decides to state that I am not a spirit, but I am a living, breathing witch named Old Kate Batts. This was a name that was a little bit too familiar, though, because there was an actual resident in the town of Red River named Kate Batts who was known for her eccentric behavior. Kate Batts lives just outside of town with her husband and their 5 kids. She's left to take care of the kids and their farm after her husband has a back injury, so she's not exactly social. But she does have an ability to draw up a crowd with her bizarre antics. Like, one morning when church begins, another resident sat in her seat, and so instead of sitting next to him, she just sits on top of him. And apparently, whenever she would meet a new person, she would insist that she received a sewing pin from them. According to superstition, this was basically the way that a witch could gain control over a person, was by receiving a sewing pin from them. So they point for this as witchcraft, and they pair this alongside an apparent business deal she had a few years prior that went south with John to paint her as the culprit. But that was only just rumors, because it was actually her brother-in-law that had the deal with John, and the Bell family was one of the few families that didn't have a problem with Kate. So they kind of keep her on the back burner, and they decide to investigate the spirit more. They come to find that it really likes John's wife, Lucy. And according to the story, in September 1820, Lucy comes down with this respiratory illness, and she's bedridden. But the whole time, the spirit lulls her to sleep, it caresses her arm, and it beckons to the other family members whenever she needs something. But on the other hand, it forces John to suffer from nightmares, he wakes up with bruises and scratches, and it's just clear that it really does not like John. Lucy eventually makes a recovery, but then John's torment really gets bad. At this point, his face is twitching uncontrollably, his tongue keeps swelling up for days on end, and he's unable to eat literally anything, and anytime he tries to sleep, he's pushed out of bed. And then one day, John hears the disembodied voice call out to him and say, "I am going to kill you." On December 19th, 1820, John Bell falls into a coma, and one of his sons rushes to the medicine cabinet to try to help him. But when he opens the cabinet, John's medicine is nowhere to be found. It's been replaced by this vial that has a smoky film on it with some sort of unknown liquid. As they grab the vial, they hear the disembodied voice yet again. But this time, it claims that it's given John a medicine that will make him better for good. One of the boys ends up throwing the vial in their fireplace, maybe thinking it was a way to stop the witch, I'm not really sure. But it basically explodes into a blue fireball, and then the house goes completely quiet. The following day, John Bell dies and they plan his funeral out. But at the funeral, the disembodied voice shows up again. This time, though, it's singing and rejoicing over John's death. After the family finishes burying John, the events in the house kind of die down, and then several years later, they hear the scratching and gnawing again just one time, and then that's it. So, what was it that tormented the Bell family for so long? Was it a vengeful spirit, or was it really a witch? And if it was a witch, then maybe it was Kate Batts. Or maybe this was a crime of passion, because according to some of the eyewitness reports, John and Lucy didn't exactly have a good relationship. So maybe she made the entire story up as a cover to poison him and get rid of a lousy husband. But whatever the theory is, I'd definitely like to know if maybe you guys have a theory you'd like to share about what the Bell Witch was. While nobody really has an answer for sure, one thing is for certain. If you pay the old Bell house a visit, you might just hear the voice of old Kate Batts calling to you. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Odd Encounters. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe and check out some of my other content. And also feel free to leave a comment down below on what you thought. If you want important show updates, you can follow me over at Odd Encounters Podcast on my social medias. And if you have a story that you would like me to feature for the Listener Encounters section of the show that I'll be working on, you can write me at oddencounterspodcast@gmail.com. Once again, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you all next week.